Hour 72. The grid's been down for 3 days. Your neighbor, David, knocked on your door this morning. Friendly, apologetic, asked if you had any water to spare. You said no. He nodded, walked back across the street. 2 hours later, you watched him walk into the Johnson house through the back door. The Johnsons left on day 1. David came out carrying their water filtration system. That's not the David you knew. That's the David that documented collapse data predicted would emerge at exactly hour 72. Not because David is a bad person, because David is a hungry person, and hungry people follow documented behavioral patterns that have been recorded across every major infrastructure failure in the last 100 years. Here's what the survival industry won't tell you. Your gear list is irrelevant if you don't understand what the humans around you are going to do and when they're going to do it. FEMA behavioral analysis from post-Katrina data, Sarajevo siege documentation, Venezuela economic collapse records, and Soviet infrastructure failure studies all show the same pattern. Human threat behavior in collapse scenarios follows a predictable timeline. Not random, not chaotic, predictable, documented, sortable by day. The homesteads still occupied in year 1 aren't occupied because they had better gear. They're occupied because they understood the human threat timeline before it started. 3 documented threat categories emerge in every recorded collapse. They don't emerge randomly. They emerge in sequence, and the sequence is always the same. Today, we analyze what the data actually shows about your neighbors. Not theory, documented behavioral patterns from people who lived through what you're preparing for.
Let's start with the first documented threat category, because it's the one that kills the most unprepared people in the first week. Not because it's the most violent, because it's the most invisible. Post-Katrina behavioral documentation from Louisiana State University shows a consistent pattern across affected communities. Within 72 hours of infrastructure failure, social organization attempts begin. Neighborhood meetings, resource sharing proposals, community committees. This sounds like cooperation. It isn't. What the data shows is the emergence of what criminologists call compliance-based resource extraction. The mechanism is social pressure, not physical force. The threat isn't a weapon, it's a narrative. Hour 72 in New Orleans' 9th Ward. Hour 72 in post-Soviet Tbilisi in 1992. Hour 72 in Caracas during the 2019 blackouts. Same pattern, same timeline, different geography, same human behavior. The compliance threat operates on a simple documented mechanism. Social capital weaponization. The people who held social authority before collapse attempt to transfer that authority into resource control after collapse. Your HOA president, your neighborhood watch coordinator, the guy who organized the block parties. These people had organizational authority in the old structure. When that structure collapses, the data shows they don't abandon their authority, they redirect it. Sarajevo siege documentation from 1992 through 95 shows neighborhood committees forming within 72 hours of the siege beginning, initially presented as cooperative resource management. Within 7 days, 40% of those committees had transitioned to coercive resource extraction, using social exclusion as the primary enforcement mechanism. You don't get community protection if you don't contribute to the community pool. That's not cooperation, that's taxation without infrastructure. And the data shows it escalates predictably. Day 3, voluntary contribution requests. Day 5, social pressure and exclusion threats. Day 7, physical enforcement attempts. The compliance threat is most dangerous because it exploits the psychological lag between when the old rules stopped working and when your brain accepts that they stopped working. Neuroscience research on behavioral adaptation shows the prefrontal cortex requires 21 to 45 days to fully update established behavioral frameworks. For the first 3 weeks, your brain is running on pre-collapse social programming. The compliance threat is specifically calibrated to exploit that programming. You feel guilty saying no. That guilt is being weaponized. Post-disaster behavioral studies from the University of Delaware Disaster Research Center document this pattern across 47 major infrastructure failures spanning 60 years. Communities that successfully navigated compliance-based extraction threats had one documented characteristic in common. They identified the threat before it materialized, not during the neighborhood meeting, before it. The intelligence indicator, within 24 to 48 hours of infrastructure failure, watched for organizational behavior. Who is convening meetings? Who is proposing resource inventories? Who is establishing committees? These are not humanitarian instincts. These are resource acquisition strategies operating under humanitarian framing. Venezuela collapse documentation from 2017 shows community resource committees in Caracas neighborhoods conducting systematic household resource surveys within 96 hours of major infrastructure failures. Households that participated in surveys reported 30 to 40% higher rates of subsequent resource extraction attempts. The survey is the threat assessment. Your countermeasure isn't refusal. Refusal signals resources worth protecting. Your countermeasure is information control. You are suffering equally. You have nothing worth surveying. You attended the meeting. You contributed the minimum visible amount. You are one of them. Documentation from Sarajevo survivors shows households that maintained perceived parity with community suffering levels experienced 60% fewer compliance-based extraction attempts than households that signaled resource abundance through behavior, lighting, cooking smells, or refusal to participate in community structures. Compliance-based threats peak between day 3 and day 7. After day 7, the data shows a consistent transition. The organizational energy either dissipates or consolidates into something more dangerous.
Day 7 through 14. Compliance committees are either collapsing under their own organizational weight or they're being quietly taken over by a different category of person. Behavioral criminology data from post-collapse scenarios shows a consistent second-wave threat emerging between day 7 and day 14, not organizers, operators. The distinction matters. Compliance threats use social leverage. Operational threats use assessed vulnerability. FBI behavioral analysis of criminal activity patterns during major infrastructure failures documents what researchers call rational adaptation. Career criminals operating in the formal economy operate on risk-benefit calculations, law enforcement response probability, arrest likelihood, consequence severity. Infrastructure collapse doesn't change the psychology, it changes the math. Post-Katrina law enforcement data shows property crime rates increased 400% within 72 hours of infrastructure failure in affected areas, not because 400% more criminals appeared, because the risk-benefit calculation changed for existing criminal populations. Zero police response probability, zero arrest likelihood, zero consequence severity. This is documented rational adaptation, not moral collapse. What the data shows about operational threats is more tactically relevant than the popular narrative suggests. These are not random actors. Post-Katrina and post-disaster criminology research from Tulane University documents systematic operational patterns emerging within 72 to 100 hours of infrastructure failure. Sequential reconnaissance, target assessment, soft target prioritization, hard target deferral. The reconnaissance phase is documented and identifiable. Night movement at irregular hours, systematic perimeter assessment of multiple properties, absence of the distress behavioral markers shown by compliance threat actors. Calm, methodical behavior when surrounding population shows panic behavioral markers. This behavioral signature is documented across collapse scenarios, from post-Soviet Georgia to post-earthquake Haiti to post-hurricane Puerto Rico. The intelligence indicator is behavioral anomaly. Someone whose behavioral pattern doesn't match the documented stress responses of the surrounding population is operating on a different information set. They're not panicking because they've already adapted to the new rules. They recognize the rules changed before you did.
Day 7 through 14, soft target operations, abandoned properties, obvious evacuee residences, businesses. Day 14 through 21, occupied residence assessment. The escalation from soft targets to occupied targets is documented in post-Katrina law enforcement records and follows a consistent resource depletion logic. Soft targets are exhausted, occupied targets contain resources. Your countermeasure operates on documented criminal psychology. Behavioral research across multiple post-collapse scenarios shows a consistent deterrence threshold. Operational threats conduct cost-benefit analysis on every potential target. Tulane criminology research documents what law enforcement calls the 7-minute threshold. Targets that present more than 7 minutes of breach time combined with active occupancy indicators show 87% lower operational threat engagement rates. You're not trying to win a fight, you're trying to change the math. Visible active occupancy indicators at irregular intervals, hardened entry points that signal time cost, environmental modifications that suggest awareness of reconnaissance activity. The operational threat is not deterred by moral argument, they're deterred by arithmetic. Post-collapse documentation from Sarajevo shows another critical pattern. Operational threats share target intelligence within their networks. The same household that deters one operational threat gets that deterrence information propagated through the network. Your reputation precedes you. Build the right one. But here's what the data shows about Day 21 that most survival analysis ignores. The operational threat doesn't remain distinct. By Day 21, documented collapse behavioral data shows threat category integration. The compliance organizer needs operational capability they don't have. The operational actor needs social legitimacy they don't have. And emerging from Day 10 onward is a third documented threat category that provides the moral framework that unifies both.
Day 10. The compliance committees are consolidating. The operational actors are escalating from soft to hard targets, and a third documented threat category is reaching critical threshold. Historical famine research, siege documentation, economic collapse behavioral studies all show the same pattern. Between Day 7 and Day 14, parental protection drives override all other behavioral frameworks in affected populations with dependent children. This isn't psychology, this is documented neuroscience with consistent cross-cultural behavioral expression recorded across every major food and water security crisis in recorded history. Irish potato famine behavioral documentation, Siege of Leningrad survivor accounts, Sarajevo siege social service records, Venezuela malnutrition crisis community health data. All show a consistent documented pattern. Parents of dependent children transition from cooperative to acquisitive behavioral modes at a measurable threshold. That threshold is tied to child developmental vulnerability timelines, not adult survival timelines. The data is specific. An infant without adequate nutrition shows measurable developmental regression within 72 hours, visible distress indicators within 48 hours. By Day 7, the behavioral indicators are unmistakable to any parent observing them. That 7-day window is when the data shows parental behavioral frameworks shift. University of Michigan crisis psychology research documents what researchers call protective override. The neurological mechanism involves amygdala activation suppressing prefrontal cortex risk assessment function. The behavioral result is documented and consistent across populations regardless of pre-crisis ethical frameworks. Risk calculation changes. The documented behavioral shift isn't from good to evil. The documented behavioral shift is from multivariable risk assessment to single-variable risk assessment. Will this keep my child alive? Yes. Then all other variables become secondary. Siege of Sarajevo social service documentation records parental involvement in resource acquisition incidents, increasing from baseline to 60% of all recorded incidents between Day 7 and Day 21 of the siege. The remaining 40% was split between opportunistic actors and organized groups. The most dangerous documented characteristic of parental threat behavior is not the individual actor, it's the network formation dynamic. Historical collapse behavioral documentation shows parental networks forming faster and with greater cohesion than either compliance-based groups or operational threat networks. The shared imperative creates organizational efficiency that neither of the other threat categories achieves independently. Venezuela crisis documentation from 2017 to 2019 shows parental resource networks in affected Caracas neighborhoods achieving full operational capability within 14 days of reaching network formation threshold. These networks conducted systematic neighborhood resource assessment, target prioritization, and coordinated acquisition operations with organizational efficiency that took compliance-based groups 3 to 4 weeks to achieve. Day 14 is the documented network formation threshold. Before day 14, individual actors operating independently, high emotional drive, low operational coordination. After day 14, networked actors with shared intelligence, coordinated operations, and distributed risk. The documented intelligence indicator is behavioral. Parents with dependent children who show calm, organized behavior rather than visible distress behavioral markers have crossed the threshold from reactive to operational. They've processed the situation, they've made decisions, they're executing. Your countermeasure for parental threat behavior is the most ethically complex documented in collapse behavioral research. University of Delaware Disaster Research Center documentation across multiple collapse scenarios shows a consistent finding. Early low-cost resource contribution to visible community need reduces parental threat network formation rates by 30 to 40% in contributor-adjacent areas. This is not charity, this is documented threat mitigation with a measurable cost-benefit outcome. 1 week of infant formula, basic water purification capacity, visible early contribution to the most acute visible need. The data shows this contribution creates a documented social categorization shift from resource holder to community contributor. That categorization shift reduces your inclusion in parental network target assessment. But the data also shows the critical threshold. The moment visible resource abundance is confirmed, the categorization shifts again, from community contributor to primary target. Information control is the documented mechanism. You contribute from scarcity, not abundance. You are struggling too. One lucky find, one extra cash you're willing to share. Never the full picture, never the actual depth. Post-collapse behavioral documentation from Sarajevo and Venezuela both show households that maintained perceived resource parity with surrounding community while quietly maintaining actual resource superiority experienced significantly lower threat engagement rates across all 3 documented threat categories. The goal is perceived equivalence, not demonstrated poverty, not revealed abundance, the appearance of surviving at the same level as everyone around you.
Day 21. The data shows this is when individual threat categories stop being individual. Balkan Civil War behavioral documentation, post-Soviet collapse records, Sarajevo siege analysis all show the same convergence pattern emerging between day 21 and day 30. The compliance organizer has social networks and legitimacy frameworks, but no operational capability. The operational actor has tactical capability, but no social legitimacy or organizational structure. The parental network has motivation and organizational cohesion, but limited tactical capability. The documented convergence mechanism is complementary capability recognition. These 3 threat categories don't compete, they integrate. Post-collapse behavioral research documents the integration timeline consistently. Day 7 to 14, independent operation. Day 14 to 21, informal information sharing. Day 21 to 30, operational integration with role differentiation. The compliance organizer provides social cover and recruitment. The operational actor provides tactical planning and execution capability. The parental network provides motivation, numbers, and the moral framework that allows the coalition to characterize resource acquisition as community necessity rather than predation.
The documented result is a force multiplication dynamic that individual household defensive position cannot mathematically counter. Military doctrine defines effective force as individual capability multiplied by coordination factor. A coordinated group of 15 people doesn't represent 15 times one individual's defensive capability. It represents 15 times 3 to 5, depending on coordination efficiency, against a single household defensive position. The math is documented. The outcome is predictable. Post-collapse documentation from the Balkan Civil War shows independent households facing integrated threat coalitions achieving successful resistance in fewer than 12% of documented confrontations. Households integrated into counter-coalitions achieved successful resistance in 73% of documented confrontations. The documented survival variable isn't gear, it isn't tactical preparation, it's social integration. The homesteads still occupied in year 1 had community structures before the threat coalitions formed, not during, before. Pre-collapse community integration is the only documented countermeasure to threat convergence that shows statistically significant survival correlation in the historical data. Everything else is managing symptoms. Community integration before collapse is the only documented cure.
Hour 72, Day 7, Day 21, Day 45. The human threat timeline isn't speculation. It's documented behavioral data from people who survived what you're preparing for. Compliance-based threats emerge at hour 72. Operational threats escalate from Day 7 to Day 21. Parental threat networks reach operational capability by Day 14. Convergence happens by Day 30. None of this is random. None of this is unpredictable. All of it is documented. The survival industry sold you a gear problem when the data shows you have a human behavior problem. Your battery bank doesn't help you at Day 21 when the coalition has mapped your resources and built the organizational structure to take them. Your food storage doesn't help you at Day 30 when the convergence has produced a force multiplication dynamic your single household cannot counter. What the data shows helps you is understanding the timeline before it starts, building community structures before threat coalitions form, maintaining perceived resource equivalence across all 3 threat categories simultaneously. Not theory, documented survival outcomes from the Balkan Civil War, the siege of Sarajevo, the Venezuelan economic collapse, and post-Katrina behavioral research. The people still alive in year 1 understood the human threat timeline. The ones who didn't became data points in someone else's documentation.
Comment below. What day are you on in your community assessment? Have you mapped your neighborhood's threat timeline? Are you building community structures before you need them? Drop your observations in the comments. What behavioral patterns are you seeing in your area right now? The more documented observations we have from different regions, the better our collective threat assessment becomes. Subscribe for survival analysis built on documented behavioral data from historical collapse events, criminology research, and post-disaster field studies. Not psychology speculation, not gear reviews. What the data actually shows about human behavior when infrastructure fails permanently. This is Fallout Rat. Stay filthy, stay smart, stay rational when everyone around you is becoming a data point in the human threat timeline.